Good morning. We want to welcome everybody to today's webinar, Introduction to the Global Internal Audit Standards. So we're looking forward for Doug Mims to go over his material today. So thank you for joining us. Just a few housekeeping matters. This course does qualify for CPE. It's 1 hour credit, and you have to log in on a unique link. So if you're on your iPhone or your laptop, just make sure you stay on that device the entire time. And then we would have 4 poll questions. So you as a participant to get CPE credit must answer 80% of those poll questions. You don't have to get them right, just answer the question. And then what we'll do, we'll distribute certificates within 7 days of this webinar, and they'll be emailed to you, the participants. And then questions about the certificate process can be emailed to our marketing department at marketing@cricpa.com. And just for your reference, a PDF of the handouts of the presentation today are in the chat section of the webinar. So thank you. And today I want to introduce our presenter, Doug Mims. He's our partner in our Atlanta office. He's also our subline leader for financial institutions on our financial services industry line. He's got many various professional affiliations. He's a member of the Association to Advance Collegiate Schools of Business, and he's also a member of the Georgia Bankers Association, the Accountants Section Board. He's a past chair in Georgia Society CPAs, the Institute of Internal Auditors, Atlanta Chapter Advisory Board, and then the Kennesaw State University Internal Audit Center Advisory Board. He's also very active in Troy University. He's a former football player for Troy University, so you can see that he's on the School of Accountancy Advisory Council. He's also on the Foundation Board of Directors, and he's also on the Sorrell College of Business Advisory Council, and he's chair-elect. And if you don't see Doug at work, he's always at a Troy athletics game, or you can find him at any Atlanta pro sports, whether it be at the Falcons, the Hawks, or the Atlanta Braves. and it's always with his family. So he does make time for his family outside of work. So we're glad to have Doug be our presenter today. And of course, I'm Phyllis Ingram. I was one of the original 16 partners that started Carr, Riggs, and Ingram some 26 years ago. And it's my privilege today to be just the moderator. And so for now, I will turn it over to Doug Mims.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thanks everyone for joining us today to talk about the Global Internal Audit Standards. We call it an introduction because I think that's really what it is. It's a high-level overview. That document, just in full disclosure to make sure everybody understands, was issued as a draft. And so the components that we're going to cover today are from the draft document. And we'll talk about the timeline on that here in a moment. But so we'll go today's agenda in our 1 hour session. We'll go over the overview and timeline, the applicability of the standards, the structure of the standards. We'll go over the domains 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we'll cover what the topics are in there. But we'll give you a good high-level overview and try to explain how the standards are structured and the implications of them. So from a timeline perspective, the existing IPPF for internal audit, it was updated last in 2017. And so this would be the first update in I guess 6 years-ish. The global internal audit standards were issued in March after a 2-year, there was a development period of about 2 years, and they were issued in March. And there was a comment period from issuance in March until the end of May. So there was a survey you could respond to, and that's already taken place. And just again, kind of in a full disclosure, the global internal audit standards are trademarked by the IIA, and everything herein that we're going over is extracted from that information. It's not original content from CRI. It's things we extracted out to provide you with an overview of the standards. So the top changes to the IPPF that were proposed in the draft, and this is the top changes as represented by the IIA, were to simplify the structure, to consolidate certain elements of the existing standards, to create a new purpose of internal auditing, which we'll cover, to enrich ethics and professionalism by adding due professional care, which we'll go over. There were also additions of recommended practice and evidence of conformance, and I'll touch on that. And then also they felt like they had built in nuances for public sector and small internal audit functions and those type of things. I think a couple of the more significant changes is really the clarification of the role of the board of directors, as well as clarifying the role and defining what a chief audit executive is. So we'll go through all those things at a very high level. So here's the structure, and everybody just look. We did this previously internally, and we had a little bit more time. But everybody says, "Man, these are a lot of slides." Therefore, I'm going to move quickly. But I want you to have them as a takeaway. As part of participating, you'll get the slides, and if nothing else, it saves you from having to read 107 pages. You can, look at 60 slides instead of 107 pages. But you'll see by looking at this overview, kind of why it's so much material. So there's 5 domains and there's 15 principles, but there's 52 standards underneath those 15 principles. So in order to cover it all, you kind of have to have a lot of slides. So we have a lot of slides. That was domains 1 and 2. You can kind of see domain 3, and we'll cover that here: governing the internal audit function, managing the internal audit function. Again, you'll have this in your slides, and I will go over these in individual slides. So each standard, what we're going to go over are the requirements under each standard in a condensed format. Under each standard, there are also considerations for implementation and evidence of conformance. They're not in here. You'll have to go to the document to get those, but that is built in under each standard. So what we're going to cover today are the requirements of each standard. So applicability. The standards apply to anyone who provides internal audit services. That's anybody, whether you're just an individual, whether you're part of a company and an internal audit function, whether you're part of a professional services firm like Phyllis and I. The internal audit standards apply to you. They also apply to any internal audit function in general. So it applies to individual auditors as well as the internal audit function. Also, all internal auditors are responsible for conforming with the principles and standards in the ethics and professionalism domain, which we'll cover. And chief audit executives, and we'll talk about the definition of that in a second, are also accountable for their internal audit functions being operating in accordance with the standards. So individuals and internal audit functions with a little bit of added responsibility for a chief audit executive because they're responsible for their respective functions. And these are some caveats to that you can read later. So under the standards, just to define what the services are. So the first definition would be advisory services. Under the existing IPPF, those are called consulting services. So advisory services, advice, and consulting services. I think one thing that stands out, so there still is that delineation, but these standards apply to both. And there was a little bit more separation of the two is in the current IPPF. But even whether you're providing consulting services, advisory services, or assurance services, the nature and scope of the subject matter needs to be agreed upon with the party whom you're doing it for. So that's an important point. But advisory services and then assurance services. And if you're with a CPA firm, and we have a very diverse group here on today, but if you are one of the folks that's with a CPA firm, assurance means something totally different in the CPA world than it does in the internal audit world. That in this instance, we're not talking about opining on financial statements or anything of that sort. It's basically the services in which internal auditors perform objective assessments to prepare statements about conditions compared to criteria. It's basically what a traditional internal audit is. You have a set of criteria you're auditing to, and you identify if there's any differences between what you expect based on the criteria and the actual what you find when you audit. So that would be so anytime I say assurance, that's what that's talking about. And Well, that's pretty good. That's pretty good coverage on that. So we'll move on. Okay. So Chief Audit Executive, just for reference purposes, throughout the document, it says Chief Audit Executive. That means whoever's in charge of audit. That could be one person. If there's one internal auditor, the internal audit manager or something like that, that could be the Chief Audit Executive. In here, there's a few different names, but at the end of the day, it's whoever's in charge of audit. So Chief Audit Executive means whoever's running it. Okay. So we come to our first poll question.
Thank you, Doug, and I'm glad that it's true, false. So all of our poll questions are true, false. So the first poll question is the global internal audit standards were effective upon issuance. True or false? And we'll give you a few seconds to answer the question before we close the poll.
So we're effective upon issuance as a draft.
We'll see how well you did, Doug.
Okay, well, it's almost 50-50, 52-48. It's true. They were, I didn't do very well, Phyllis. So the draft, it was a draft. There was a comment period. They'll take into consideration the feedback and eventually come out with another, either a final version or possibly another draft, I suppose. But that process is still ongoing. So we're covering a draft today, which means the final document may be different, but what we're covering right now is not effective as of today. It will be effective at a later date whenever the IIA tells us it is. Okay. So we're just trying to get some CPE today is what I'm feeling. Okay. So the purpose of internal auditing is domain one, and this is new for under this standard from the IPPF. So I thought we would cover this a little bit more in detail. So internal auditing enhances the organization's success by providing the board and management with objective assurance and advice. So assurance services and advisory. Internal audit strengthens the organization's value creation, protection, and sustainability, governance, risk management, and control processes, which is what we tend to focus on as internal auditors, right or wrong. That's kind of where we wind up. Decision-making and oversight, reputation and credibility with its stakeholders, ability to serve the public interest. So that's the purpose of internal audit. Internal audit is most effective when it's performed by qualified internal auditors and done in conformance with the standards, which are set in the public interest. And the internal audit function, another attribute would be the internal audit function is independently positioned with direct accountability to the board, and internal auditors are free from bias and undue influence. So those are the things that the standards are representing as being when internal audit is most effective, when it's done under the standards, when the internal audit function is independent, and the internal auditors are free from bias and undue influence from other sources. Domain two is ethics and professionalism, which is new as we know from our previous discussion. So we're going into principle one, and under principle one, there's standard 1.1. So that's kind of the hierarchy I was showing you earlier. So principle one, standard 1.1, honesty and courage. And really what this says is that internal auditors should be transparent and say what needs to be said and do so even if there is conflict associated with it at some level. So exhibit courage by communicating truthfully and taking appropriate action, even when confronted by dilemmas and difficult situations, which if you've been doing internal audit any amount of time, or audit for that matter, there are times when there's disagreements or contentious situations. And what this is saying is tell the whole truth, tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So that's 1.1. Standard 1.2 is organizations' ethical expectations. Internal auditors must understand and meet their organization's ethical expectations. They also must, and anytime it says must means it's required, and this isn't true throughout the document unless there's a typo. Internal auditors must encourage and promote an ethics-based culture. So that is 1.2 in the new standard. Principle 1, under demonstrate integrity, standard 1.3, legal and professional behavior. Essentially, you need to abide by the law is what this says, which is, some of this is intuitive, I get it, and that's why I'm moving quickly on it, but you need to conform to the law. But the last bullet is a little bit off of that. Internal auditors must not engage in or be a party to any activity that may harm the organization or its employees. So it's not just legal, but you also need to not engage in anything that would be harmful to your organization. Okay, so that's principle 1. Principle 2, standard 2.1, individual objectivity. So this is talking about the individual auditor, because if you go back, this applies to anybody that provides internal audit services, both the individual and the function. So professional objectivity requires internal auditors to apply an impartial and unbiased mindset and make judgments based on balanced assessment of all relevant circumstances. So you need to be unbiased and you need to have a balanced assessment of all the relevant facts associated with what you're doing to maintain objectivity. There'll be other discussions about independence because there's a little bit of a difference there. Standard 2.2 requires the safeguarding of objectivity. In order to do that, internal auditors should avoid accepting any tangible or intangible item from an auditee. They should also avoid conflicts of interest, including situations, activities, and relationships. So you need to remain objective, don't take any gifts and things of that nature, tangible or otherwise, and avoid conflicts of interest. And that's not necessarily monetary, it could be personal as well. Standard 2.3, disclosing impairments of objectivity. If in fact you're aware that you have an issue, your objectivity is impaired, you should disclose it in advance or at the point you're aware of it with all relevant parties. So there could be circumstances where you think you can be objective and your objectivity wouldn't be impaired, and something might change. Someone may be hired into management of the department you're auditing or something like that. But there could be circumstances where it arises, and it's incumbent upon the internal auditor to take ownership and disclose those matters to all appropriate folks. And I think depending on the nature of what you're doing and the nature of your company, it might be to the board, it might be to senior management, it might be to the chief audit executive. Principle 3 is demonstrate competency. So standard 3.1 under that competency, engage in only those services for which an internal auditor has or can obtain the necessary competencies and continually develop and apply the competencies. So don't do anything you're not qualified to do. And anybody who does internal audit or provides professional services, we're challenged in that regard a lot of times because we try to stretch ourselves and be and grow, but you got to balance that with, are you actually competent to do what needs to be done for your organization? So you should only do the things that you're capable of doing, and you should continually develop your skill sets to apply your competencies. Standard 3.2 is continuing professional education. All internal auditors should get at least a minimum of 20 hours of relevant CPE on an annual basis. Obviously, if you have certifications like of any sort, but in this case, if you have the CIA, that 40 is the requirement, or I think that's the requirement. I think that's what I do. So whatever your certifications, you need to do what you need to do to keep those relevant certifications. But the minimum standard for an internal auditor under this draft document would be 20 hours. Okay. Principle 4 is exercising due professional care. This is new for this, under the new standards. And number 1 is really conforming with the standards. Taking the individual auditor's responsibility is to conform with the standards. And for an internal audit function, the internal audit function should have methodologies, must be established that to in alignment with the standards. So from an individual, you're responsible for complying with the standards. The internal audit function should have processes in place to ensure compliance of the internal audit function, which we also know is the responsibility of the chief audit executive. Principle 4, continued under due professional care. There's a number of things under here that internal auditors must do in order to demonstrate due professional care. In what an auditor does, you should take into account, the strategies and objectives of the organization, the best interest of the auditee and stakeholders, the adequacy of governance, risk, and controls. I won't go through all these. You can refer back to them, but it's really a lot of the things that you would expect to be in here, but some of them are let's say, a little more qualitative than just black and white, if you will. But it addresses competency, but also being thoughtful about the best interest of the organization under Standard 4.2. Standard 4.3 is professional skepticism, and that's something that's not a new concept if you're a CPA type, but an auditor should maintain an attitude that includes a questioning mind, critically assess, which would include critically assessing the reliability of information and seeking additional evidence to make judgments to ensure that you've arrived at the most appropriate answer. So questioning mind, critically assessing reliability of information, and seeking additional evidence as appropriate under Standard 4.3. Standard 5.1, so we move into Principle 5. Again, there's 15 principles. We're on Principle 5, maintain confidentiality. So 5.1 is the use of information. I think we're all very sensitive to that as far as we look at information. We do a lot internal audit for a lot of financial institutions. Certainly there's a lot of information there that's confidential, and we seek to handle it as such in terms of controls around that. One interesting point here, internal auditors must collect and document only the information required to perform the task. So I think about things like if you were testing HR, for instance, and you were selecting a random sample or a haphazard sample, and you were going to test 25 employees or whatever, if there's somebody you're just kind of interested what their salary is, you shouldn't do that. You should truly have a haphazard selection of 25 and not look at anything that's not directly related to and necessary for you to carry out your task. So that's an interesting point there. But otherwise, I think we're all very aware of in the IT world and all the other things about maintaining confidentiality of information, which kind of segues into Standard 5.2, which is protecting information. So the internal audit function likely would have, or the organization would have criteria for how you protect information, and an internal auditor should be aware of those and ensure that they demonstrate the respect for confidentiality, privacy, and ownership of information. Okay, poll question 2.
Okay, another true false. Internal auditors should not disclose impairments of their objectivity with regard to an internal audit. True or false?
Keywords are should not disclose impairments.
And Doug, while they're answering, we had a question come in. Just in your personal opinion, do you think there'll be any significant changes from the draft?
Yeah. Hey, John, I don't know. I don't know. I think they've probably received a lot of feedback. I've read a lot of opinions, other folks' opinions on the draft document. I thought, and by the way, I thought they did a really good job with the questionnaire. Others might disagree, but I thought it was well done, and it facilitated you giving relevant feedback. Do I think there'll be changes? Yes. And we'll actually, as we get through here, I'll talk about a little bit about where I think probably a lot of the discussion has been. And it's not really only, I don't think it's been around. I've not seen anything. When I'm reading the rags, if you will, and the opinion things, I've not seen much discussion about what we've covered so far. But there has been discussion about the role of the board and some other things, and I'll make reference to that when we go through.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good. So false, that's good. You're doing good. Doug?
Disclose. I'm trying to make sure I've got the right answer in my mind. That's right. That's right. Okay. All right. So we'll move it on. We did better on that one. Still got a contingent that's just getting CPE. That's okay. All right. Domain 3. So again, 5 domains. We're domain 3, governing the internal audit function. This is kind of where I need to pick up the pace because they start getting, there's more standards up under the principles as we move forward. So the internal audit mandate. The internal audit mandate is the authority, role, and responsibilities of the internal audit function are defined in the internal audit mandate. So there's a concept here of having an internal audit mandate over the top. It's not the internal audit charter. We'll cover the internal audit charter, but this is the mandate that comes. And note, this is principle 6, authorized by the board. So the board is authorizing the internal audit mandate for the organization. So it's the overarching authority, role, and responsibilities of the function. So you need to have an internal audit mandate that's authorized by the board, empowered by the board. Standard 6.2 is board support. The way the board demonstrates its support, and these are just some of the ways that are referenced in the standard, by approving the internal audit mandate, by ensuring the chief audit executive reports to a level within the organization that allows he or she to do their job and the internal audit function to do its job, approving the internal audit charter, the internal audit plan, the budget, and the resource plan. And meeting as necessary with the CAE in sessions without senior management, what we commonly call executive session. So those are there should be an internal audit mandate that is authorized by the board, and these are some of the ways that the board can demonstrate that it is supporting the internal audit function. Principle 7, positioned independently. So internal audit should be positioned independently. So we'll kind of read some of that. I'll go through here. So independence is defined as the freedom from conditions that impair the ability of the internal audit function to carry out internal audit responsibilities in an unbiased manner. The internal audit function is only able to achieve the purpose of internal auditing fully when the chief audit executive reports directly to the board and is appropriately positioned in the organization. So not uncommon discussion is where does internal audit sit in the actual management hierarchy? Where is the dotted line, the administrative line? There needs to be a direct line to the board, which we've all, well, I say we all, I don't speak for everybody, but most people think that's appropriate. But in the organization, where does it report? And if, is that spot appropriate in consideration of what the internal audit function needs to do? So that's an ongoing discussion. I think the most common reporting structure, I think I saw a survey the other day on LinkedIn. I can't remember what the source was, but I still think the most common reporting up through an organization, the most common avenue is the chief financial officer at this point. That's what I see. I see chief risk officer some too in our practice. Principle 7, again, positioned independently. Standard 7.2, chief audit executive's roles, responsibilities, and qualifications. The board must, I think this might be the first must, but the board must approve the chief audit executive's roles and responsibilities. So this is a requirement being placed by the standards on the board, which when John asked earlier, he was saying, hey, do you think they'll change? I don't know about this, but I believe I read where somebody said there were 30 references in the document that said must in relation to the board. but boards of directors don't provide internal audit services. Therefore, they're not subject to the standards, if you will. So how does that really work in practice? Should that be a must? That's, obviously it's prescriptive. I'm not advocating it or not. I'm just pointing out what I've observed. So, but the board must approve the CAE's roles and responsibilities, and the board must ensure the CAE has the qualification and competencies to manage the internal audit function effectively. I mean, those things should seem like things that should happen. I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but I'm not sure how you enforce everything that might be mandated on the board in the document. So I guess we'll see how that plays out. 7.3, safeguarding independence. The board must protect independence of the function and by ensuring that appropriate safeguards are in place and they're designed adequately and operating effectively. So you don't want management to have undue influence over the internal audit function, particularly if they're not, if they're not independent, and they likely would not be. So that's what that's referencing. Principle 8 is overseen by the board. Standard 8.1, board interaction. Board oversight must include ongoing communication with the chief audit executive. The board must communicate its perspectives, etc., and risk to the CAE with determining internal audit priorities. So this is basically saying that the board must interact with the CAE on a routine basis and provide their input into the audit plan and the things that are taking place. Again, a mandate on the board. And I didn't say this, but board of directors is board of directors, but it could be a committee, right? I mean, there's the audit committee, there's risk committees, there's other ways that could be accomplished. So it's not necessarily the board, just like it's not necessarily the chief audit executive. Standard 8.2, resources. At least annually, the board must ask the CAE about the sufficiency of internal audit resources. So obviously resources are important. The standards are saying, hey, standard 8.2 is saying the board must inquire of the CAE in a formal way if they have sufficient resources to carry out the mandate. Standard 8.3 is quality. So the board is charged with making sure that there is an appropriate quality assurance and improvement program. So that's in a CPA firm, that's quality control. So the board's responsible for making sure the internal audit function has an appropriate quality assurance and improvement program. The program must include both internal and external assessments of the function. And the board must conduct or participate with senior management in an annual assessment of the CAE's performance. So those are things that the board is responsible for under the standard as it relates to the internal audit function and quality. Standard 8.4, external quality assessment. You have to have one at least every 5 years. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. Yeah. Okay, poll question.
Poll question number 3. In most instances, audit executives should report directly to the chief operating officer to ensure independence. True or false? We'll wait just a few seconds to keep an answer and then we'll close the poll. Doug, I think you have about 15 minutes left.
Well, I think we go all the way to 12.
Okay, good.
I got 25, but I do need to pick up the pace anyway.
Okay.
That is a point. That's a good point either way. 15 or 20.
Good.
Yeah, so probably shouldn't report through the chief operating officer because you do a lot of operational audits typically. And so that would be, might not be organizationally independent. So good answers. Okay, so we'll press on. Okay, domain 4, managing the internal audit function. So standard 9.1, understanding governance, risk management, and control processes. And basically this says that the CAE must understand governance, risk management, and control processes. Again, a lot of these things are intuitive, but that's a must and appropriate, I would think. Standard 9.2, internal audit strategy. The CAE must develop and implement a strategy for the function that supports the strategic objectives and success of the organization and aligns with the expectations of senior management, the board, and other key stakeholders. So the CAE is responsible for developing a strategy that is collectively developed, that promotes the achievement of the objectives of the organization and has buy-in from senior management and the board. Makes sense. Standard 9.3, internal audit charter. So this is one of the questions that was in the chat was, what's the difference between the charter and the mandate? I kind of view the mandate, this is developing. I kind of view the mandate as the overall, goal and kind of like a mission statement. Now, somebody who's with the IA who's on here might like shoot me for this, but I view it as the overarching mission statement. And then the kind of the how-to a little bit is the charter. I think it's the next level. And these are the things that need to be in the charter, and they look a heck of a lot like what needs to be in the charter today under the IPPF. I'm not saying it's identical, but certainly there are similarities in the elements here. So the charter is more granular, and I think the mandate is what empowers the internal audit function to be able to execute through this charter. Standard 9.4, the methodologies must guide internal audit processes and services and include, and these are some of the elements that should be in the methodology. So this is the further how-to. So you go overarching, you go charter, and then this is the policies and procedures, if you will, but this is the how do we actually do it, risk assessment, develop a plan, balance assurance and advisory, coordinating external sources, managing external providers, because you can outsource the audit, but you can't outsource the responsibility, and ensuring safeguarding of data and information. So that's under methodology. Continuing on with that, performing the audits, communicating results, monitoring and completion, assuring quality, all the things that you would expect to be incorporated into the methodology of an internal audit function. The internal audit plan, a couple things I highlighted here that I thought were most relevant. It must specify internal audit services that support the evaluation and improvement of the organization's governance, risk, management, and control processes. So in the plan, you need to define what addresses GRC, if you will, and then you also have to consider coverage of IT governance, fraud risk, and the effectiveness of the organization's compliance and ethics program. So those are they're specifically identified as considerations. Most good audit functions already were doing those, but I'm not sure. I honestly don't know if that's spelled out in the IPPF, but it's clearly spelled out here as needing to be part of the internal audit plan under Standard 9.5. Standard 9.6, coordination and reliance. There must be a method. CAE's got to develop a methodology for evaluating other providers of assurance and advisory services. Most medium-sized and large shops, maybe even small shops, outsource to firms like us or other firms. And you have to have a methodology in place to evaluate those providers because you're responsible for what they're doing. And the CAE's got to understand the scope, objectives, and results of those procedures. Again, you can outsource the activity, but you can't outsource the responsibility. Standard 10.1, financial resource management. The CAE must develop a budget. The CAE must manage the day-to-day activities of the function effectively and efficiently. So this is efficiently. So this is speaking to resource, making sure you got a budget, making sure you're trying to be as efficient and effective as possible under that program, things we all do every day. Yeah. How many times did I just click? Let's see. That's financial resources. Sorry. Human resource management. CAE must establish a program to recruit, develop, and retain. They also must ensure that their HR resources are appropriate, sufficient, and effectively deployed. So those things are actually in the standard regarding HR. So you have to recruit, develop, and retain, and then make sure that you've got appropriate resource on an ongoing basis. Technological resources, CAE must regularly evaluate IT tools. Make sure you have the right technologies to operate efficiently and effectively. So that's standard 10.3. And we're to the fourth poll question.
The board of directors is responsible for the day-to-day management of the internal audit function. True or false?
The board of directors is responsible for the day-to-day function. Management. Board of directors. Question in the chat is, can the board and audit committee perform the same functions with respect to the mandate and independence? And I think the answer to that is yes. And someone else asked a similar question. All
right, we'll close the poll.
That's right.
Did good again, Doug.
Yeah, 86% false. The board is not responsible for the day-to-day management. That is for the chief audit executive. Okay. All right, principle 11, communicates effectively. So standard 11.1, building relationships and communicating with stakeholders. The CAE must develop an approach for the internal audit function to build relationships and trust with key stakeholders. Again, that's intuitive. You got to get along with management, the board. If you're in a regulated environment, you need to have a good relationship with the regulators. If you've got third parties, you need to have third-party providers that you work with. So yeah, you need to build great relationships and communication processes, because depending on the risk profile of your company, you have a lot of stakeholders in internal audit. 11.2, effectively communicate. So that the CAE must ensure that internal audit communications are accurate, objective, clear, concise, constructive, complete, and timely. I think they got it all. So accurate, objective, clear, concise, constructive, complete, and timely. Everybody tries to do those things. I think the hardest one is probably the clear and concise part, but get your facts straight, be objective, and then be clear and concise. Communicating results of what takes place, that the CAE must communicate the results of internal audit services periodically. So they must be communicated. It doesn't say how. I don't think I abbreviated that in any way. It doesn't say how you have to communicate them, and it doesn't say any frequency. Periodically, I guess, would assume at least annually, but not sure about that. 11.4, errors and omissions. If the internal audit function issues something that's incorrect and they need to reissue it, then they need to do it with, as soon as possible, and make sure they do it with all relevant parties. 11.5, communicating the acceptance of risk. This was is something that maybe is easier said than done, but when the CAE concludes that management has accepted a level of risk that exceeds the organization's risk tolerance, the matter must be discussed with senior management. I would think that if that came up in the form of an audit, I would like to think that we would actually discuss it with senior management and report it to the board, assuming we didn't resolve it at that level. But in this case, if management exceeds the risk tolerance of the organization, it must be discussed with senior management. Principle 12 is enhances quality, and this is really all around the internal quality assessment process. So there needs to be periodic self-assessments or assessments by other persons within the organization. It needs to be done internally by someone with the requisite skill and knowledge to do so. Periodic, I'm not sure, it doesn't actually define that. Communication with the board, at least annual, about the results of internal assessments. So I guess I'll back up on that and say there should be internal assessments done by someone with the requisite skill and knowledge to do so. And they should be done at least annually, or else you couldn't report to the board annually, but they certainly could be done more frequently. Standard 12.2, performance measurement. The CAE must develop a performance measurement methodology. The CAE must solicit feedback from senior management and the board. So there needs to be a methodology for measuring performance. Actual to budget's one way to do that. There's probably a lot of other higher level metrics that could be used, but measure performance and then solicit feedback from senior management and the board. Standard 12.3, the CAE must ensure that engagements are properly supervised, quality is assured, and competencies are developed. So I think that speaks for itself. That's ensuring and improving engagement performance, standard 12.3. All right, so we're to domain 5, performing internal audit services. 1146. So we're tracking pretty good, Phyllis. Standard 13.1, engagement communication. Engagement communication must include initial, ongoing, closing, and final communications. And I think we all try to do that. When you reach out and say, hey, the audit's scheduled, just send your request list. Try to keep the auditee up to date on what's going on. Have an exit meeting or whatever you choose to call it, the closing, and then and have a final communication of results. So pretty standard stuff there. Engagement risk assessment. Internal auditors must develop an understanding of the area under audit and use that understanding to assess relevant risks. So that's a requirement under standard 13.2 is that you, for an individual engagement, that you gain an understanding and that you assess risk. And that can be accomplished a variety of ways. Standard 13.3, engagement objectives and scope. Engagement objectives must articulate the purpose of the engagement. From there, the scope establishes the how-to. So here's what we're planning. Here's the objective. Here's how we're going to do it. So purpose and scope. And when I say how we're going to do it on the scope, maybe at a little bit higher level than say the work program, because I'm pretty sure that's probably next on here or somewhere in here. Standard 13.4, evaluation criteria. The auditor must identify measurable criteria to be used to evaluate the aspects of the activity under review. What I think about is, and we do a lot in the financial institution space. A lot of times we have policies where we can establish what the criteria are, or written procedures. In certain industries or scenarios, you might have control documentation that the client has done where they've done narratives and identified key controls. But you need to identify the criteria because you have to know what you're auditing to. And so part of standard 13.4 is saying, hey, make sure you have measurable criteria that you've identified. Engagement resources. Internal auditors need to ensure that they have the appropriate resource to do the work. That would include, based on the nature and complexity of the engagement, the time frame it needs to be done in, and whether or not you have appropriate and sufficient resources as it relates to, dollars, people, and technology. So nature and complexity, time frame, appropriate and sufficient resources to carry out the audit that you're going to do. Again, this stuff's kind of, somewhat intuitive. Standard 13.6 is the work program. So this is the next step in my mind from you go, what's the objective? What's the objective? What's the scope? And then what's the how-to and how are we going to document that? And so the engagement work program must identify tasks to achieve the audit objective, methodologies and tools to perform the task, and the internal auditors assigned to perform the task. So pretty commonplace to have scope / work program. Sometimes those are synonymous, but 13.6 does address that. Standard 14.1, gathering information for analyses and evaluation. Internal auditors must gather and analyze information to produce and support engagement findings. So this is essentially your audit engagement, and you're gathering information and performing testing to support your engagement findings. The information needs to be both relevant. The internal auditor needs to evaluate whether the information gathered is both relevant and reliable and is sufficient to support the finding, recommendation, or whatever it is. So relevance, reliability, sufficiency. Standard 14.1. Standard 14.2, continuing analysis and potential engagement findings. So Internal auditors must analyze information to determine whether the difference between the criteria and the activity under review. So you should take, and I kind of cut that off, but so you should take your criteria and you should apply them against the information that you receive. The difference between the criteria and the information you gathered is the condition, which could be an exception, right? So the condition is the difference between the two. And so that's where you have a potential finding or recommendation and where the evaluation process of that begins. Evaluating findings, there's a reference, there is an expectation that you identify the root cause of the condition. I'll say this on the root cause, depending on the severity, and you might not know yet, the level of diving into root cause that you do might have something to do with relative risk. We probably do more of that in a higher risk item than we do in a lower risk item. Also, one consideration of the condition is the likelihood of it occurring and the impact it may have on the organization, which that's a common consideration, likelihood and impact. So root cause, likelihood, and impact coming out of standard 14.3. 14.4, just one note. So recommendations and action plans for assurance engagements, internal auditors must obtain management's action plans to address the root cause of the finding. So this is where internal audit has to get an action plan from management. Similar to the reference I made earlier about the board, and this may actually have a little condition where it says if applicable, but that would be management's got to be willing to do an action plan, right? You have to have a culture. The board has to mandate that. That has to be part of the process. Internal audit can't make management develop an action plan. But it does say for assurance engagements as opposed to consulting engagements or advisory engagements, you must obtain a management action plan if it's applicable. Conducting engagement work, you must include a summary of the findings and outcomes. You must issue a rating, ranking, or other indicator of the significance of the aggregated findings. So this is prescriptive. It's saying you must issue a rating, ranking, or other indicator. Now, most of us do something like that, whether it's an internal audit department or a firm, but this is basically saying that you have to do it. And for assurance engagements, the engagement conclusion must include the internal auditor's judgment regarding the effectiveness of governance, risk management, and control processes. And that's a must. And that's not in the current IPPF to my knowledge. These are things that it's saying you have to do. And I don't know that that's commonplace right now to drawing that conclusion. But certainly it's not uncommon for individual findings to be risk rated. It's not uncommon for there to be overall ratings of internal audits. 14.6, the analysis, evaluatings, and supporting information relevant to an engagement must be documented such that an informed, prudent internal auditor or similarly informed competent person could repeat the work and derive the same findings, recommendations, and conclusions. This is what we call the reperformance standard. So internal audit work needs to be documented in a manner that if someone with the requisite skill and knowledge to come behind you could look at what you did, understand what you did, and essentially reperform it and come to the same conclusion. And that, again, we call it the reperformance standard, but that's 14.6 essentially has that requirement as it relates to documenting engagements. Okay. Standard 15.1, for each engagement, internal auditors must develop final communications that includes the engagement's objectives, scope, and conclusions. Recommendations or agreed upon action plans must also be included. Any scope limitations need to be explained, and the final communication must specify the individuals responsible for taking action on the findings that have been identified and their planned date of remediation. So those are musts as outlined in standard 15.1. And then finally, confirming the implementation of action plans, internal auditors must follow an established methodology to confirm remediation, essentially, right? So this is saying you have to have a management plan and you have to track it and test for remediation. I'm not sure You know, there's times when internal audit does that. There's times when the second line might do that. So maybe there's more than one way you could address that, but at least right now, that's what standard 15.2 says. And with that, we are to the end with 4 minutes left. So I'll check the Q&A. In a one-person audit shop, is the requirement for an internal assessment effectively disqualifying the auditor from passing a peer review? Yeah, I don't know about that one, Danny. I'd have to ponder that one. Melinda, regarding 13.6, do you have any suggestions regarding review of the work program for a one-person audit shop in a local government? There is no small audit shop considerations provided here. I have absolutely no knowledge of governmental audit, but the good news is we got a lot of people that do. So I will pass your question along, Melinda. And then John said, I would say no. And I think that's to Melinda's question. Anyway, okay. So Danny, I'm not sure about that. I'll ponder that one. I think we're good. Okay. Anything else in these chat rooms that I'm missing? Well, let me check this. We have 3 minutes. One person shop. Okay, so yeah, okay. So that's in response, and I'm sure that Danny can see that. Okay, so I think we're good to go. Appreciate everybody joining us. I know we kind of went fast. That's why it was an overview. There's a lot out there. As I mentioned, there's some further guidance in the standard. Hopefully this gives you something. You can refer back to the slides. We'll stay tuned. I do think I read that the intent is to have the final standards maybe by the end of this year. I read that somewhere. I don't know if it was authoritative, but I think that's going to depend on how much feedback they got back. But in the meantime, we know the landscape's changing and we know it's not that far away.
Doug, that was great information, and we appreciate the slides that everybody can have as a resource. So we just appreciate you taking time today, Doug, to update us on what's going on with internal audit.
Okay, well, thank you, Phyllis, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Have a great week.